think we're good to go. All right, well, it's nice to get back here into the department, although I usually get here most days, but it's nice to have an official assignment here today. I do want to talk about horticulture and biodiversity, and this is the outline that I'm going to use. I'll start off with just some introductory comments, give you some idea of the objective I have for the presentation today, and then some background on me. Just most of you know who I am, but I want to give you a little bit more background than that so you can see the perspective I have on this particular subject. Then I'll give you a brief overview of the global biodiversity situation. Some of you may be familiar with it, but I think it's important that we look at that. Then talk a bit about how horticulture interacts with biodiversity, particularly in terms of biodiversity conservation, as well as the utilization of biodiversity. And then finish up with some conclusions and then a look towards the future. The objectives I've got are to, first of all, just heighten our awareness about horticulture and its interaction with biodiversity. I don't know that we often think about those two subjects together. Sometimes maybe we do. In some fields we may do more so than others. I want to promote this is a thought-promoting kind of seminar today. I won't show a lot of research results. I'll show a few. But mostly it's to have us think about this, to talk about it from a global perspective, and also for students that might be in here, this is really going to be a bigger issue as we go further into the future. My generation has done some work in this area, but there's going to be more that needs to be done for the next generation of scientists that come up. So I want to think about it in those terms. And then I'd like to hopefully maybe foster some collaboration between horticulture and the applied biodiversity sciences, because I don't know that there's that much interchange between those two groups. And then consider changes, and that word change, that brings fear and sometimes into the hearts of faculty members. This saying that nobody likes change except a wet baby. And then there's this kind of satirical poster that talks about change and says it's a short trip between from riding the waves of change to being torn apart by the jaws of defeat. And so that's sometimes how we fear change. We like to have progress, but we don't like to have change. In their book, Reframing Organizations, Bowman and Deal had this to say about change at universities. They said the result is a paradox at universities. Individual professionals may be at the forefront of their specialties, while the institution as a whole changes at a glacial pace. And then, Dan, maybe you can identify with the department head here. And I don't think it's that the faculty necessarily always fear change. It's just really hard to get consensus about what we ought to do. Everybody has a strong opinion about what we ought to do. And so as department head and having had experience in that role, it's just sometimes very difficult to bring out a consensus and decide which direction to go. There was also this was a top quote there was from an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It said this: many professions advertise for leaders, but by a wide margin, higher education leads the pack in stating hallucinatory job specifications. When you read what we want in a dean or a president or even a department head, and you look at all the things we expect out of them, they describe it here as a bit hallucinatory to think that one person could do all that. And then at the bottom is a response to that particular comment that was from a skeptical faculty member who will remain unnamed at a university. He said, you never see an ad for an if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of administrator. An administrator's main goal is to always polish his resume by instituting the appearance of major changes. Those are the good ones. The bad ones actually do make major changes, usually screwing up things in the process. So that's kind of the skeptical view. But anyway, I wanted to say that as we think about change and understand that it does cause some discomfort at times. Okay, just a bit about me. My current position, I'm on a 10-month appointment now. I'm assigned 80% to the Borlaug Institute for International Agriculture and 20% to the department. Just so that everybody understands this, former department heads like me, like Dan was, now he's back, he's rotated back, but former department heads are on loan, basically, from the dean's office. And so that's just something I want that to be ingrained in the culture of the department, that they understand that, because I didn't know that coming in as department head back in 2003. We had a couple former department heads at that time, and I had no idea. I assumed we kept those positions, and that assumption was incorrect. I don't think anybody knew the rules, because this isn't written down anywhere. But when you go to the dean and talk about this, that is the rule, is that department heads are on loan from the dean's office. And when they leave, the money goes back to the dean, not to the department. So that's something, I mentioned that just so everybody is aware of it, and we can ingrain that in the memory of the department, in the culture of the department. Now, my primary responsibility at Borlaug, as Joe mentioned, is I'm regional director for Asia, and that just started really just in August. When Elsa Morano came on as the interim director, she reorganized things and asked me to take on that role as regional director for Asia. I also have a responsibility to provide technical expertise related to plant science programs, all kinds of crop type aspects, and so that's really what I do over there. In the department, I have responsibilities to do study abroad, to facilitate that, to participate in study abroad, overall to support internationalization of our curriculum, so it fits nicely with my Borlaug assignment from that standpoint. And then service, I've been asked to serve as the Promotion and Tenure Committee Chair, and then a lot of service in the profession related to a conference called Desert Technologies 11, which I'll chair next year in San Antonio. It's an international conference. I'm not going to say much about that today. And then I've been involved with quite a few external academic program reviews, like the one we're having in April here in the department. And then I do some things for ASHS and serve on another international council called the US-Indo Joint Council. So that's what I'm doing these days. I just wanted to give that as kind of a perspective of where I'm coming from. During the first year at the Borlaug Institute, before this August 1st change that came up and made me the regional director for Asia, my responsibility was to be the program director for biodiversity, and so that's where I started to learn more about this topic. Now, also from my background, I started out in California. I was born there, and I think of as California as the largest horticulture state. I don't think about Hollywood. I'm from Northern California. Those of us from Northern California don't really care about the Hollywood scene. But of course, most people think of Hollywood when they think of California. But I was really in the northern part and in a very horticultural area, as you'll see in a minute. All my degrees are in horticulture and plant sciences, so that's the perspective I come from. I did my research when I had an active research program. It was in whole plant physiology, particularly with landscape and ornamental plants, but also had an opportunity to do some work with fruits and vegetables at various times during my career. I spent 7 years at Dallas at an urban research and extension center as the director there, 8.5 years as head of this department. And I've been in about 30 countries now. And when I think about those countries, the four that come to mind when it comes to biodiversity are Indonesia, Guatemala, Honduras, and South Africa. Those four are considered biodiversity hotspots. That is, they have a high level of biodiversity. And so those are the places I've been. So I just mentioned all this so you can get my perspective and understand where I'm coming from as I present this. And this is the areas my daughter at a family reunion this past summer. And I come from Sonoma County. It's known for vineyards. And I really always thought that there really hadn't been much change there. It's an area that does resist change. There's very strict zoning laws in Sonoma County to slow down change and urbanization and all those things. But as I looked at this picture and thought about it, there had been a lot of changes. Down on the flat land there, behind the pickup there in the vehicle that you see, is a vineyard. And back when I was growing up, when you drove by that area, there were no vineyards down there at all in this particular valley. It was mostly all plums that were grown for prunes back in those days. So it's all changed. So the horticultural diversity of this area has changed completely from plums to prunes to grapes. And then the hillsides were untouched back in those days. So the hillside you see in the background looked like what you see in the upper left and upper right-hand corner of that picture. You see the green, it's forested areas in the hills there in California. But now they've gone in and done a lot of terracing and made vineyards on those areas. So the change even there, when I looked at this, was even much greater than I had realized in an area that is really resists change, but there is a big change there in the biodiversity composition of that area. That valley is just a couple valleys over from the famous San Joaquin Valley, which is considered the salad bowl of the United States. And that patchwork you see there, every bit of that is horticultural crops of one type or another. It will be tree crops, it'll be vegetables, it'll be even some ornamentals. And so you see this very horticulturally diverse landscape. This is from way up in the air, so it may be a little bit hazy to see it, but this is the area that's very diverse from a horticultural standpoint, but the native vegetation is almost completely gone. You only see a few patches of native vegetation. So again, dramatic changes. So that's, again, just a perspective from where I've been. Okay, now let's talk about this global biodiversity situation. So what is the situation? And just to make sure we understand what's meant by biodiversity, I've just thrown up a few definitions here of biodiversity. In the Chevron corporate responsibility statement, they just say biological diversity or biodiversity refers to the variety of life on Earth, very simple definition. Then Wikipedia and Stanford Encyclopedia each have similar kinds of definitions about how biodiversity is the degree of variation of life forms within a given species, ecosystem, biome, or an entire planet. And so those are the kinds of definitions that you see when you look up biodiversity. With this situation, and right now we do have a situation that's critical. Right now, according to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, about 1 out of 8 bird species is at threat for extinction, about 1 out of 4 mammals, 1 out of 4 conifers, 1 out of 3 amphibians, and then the marine turtles are the ones that are in particularly bad shape, with 6 out of every 7 marine turtle species being endangered and a threat for extinction. So it is a pretty serious situation. Along with that, ocean biodiversity is declining. Roughly 1/3 of the reef-building corals on Earth are now threatened with extinction. 75% of the world's fisheries are overexploited. And then getting a little closer to what we do in horticulture, 75% of the crop genetic diversity has been lost. In other words, another way to say that is now the world is fed by a relatively small number of species, and then that spins off the term called agrobiodiversity. And so that's something for us to be concerned with. And so that's kind of, in a nutshell, that situation. Now, what's driving this? What's driving this situation? What are the factors that influence this? There are direct drivers, which would be things like land use conversion. That includes urbanization and conversion to agriculture. Could be overexploitation of the land, such as, or the resource, such as overfishing. It can be too many tourists in a national park that put a burden on the resources there that can't be handled. There are invasive species causing a problem that they can reduce biodiversity in the area. Pollution certainly can, and climate change. So those are some of the direct drivers that are driving this loss of biodiversity worldwide. Indirectly, there are things like population growth, which in and of itself doesn't reduce biodiversity, but because it increases the demand for food, fiber, water, and energy that's needed to promote ag production to feed everybody, it does indirectly drive the loss of biodiversity. So those are the factors that are involved. There's just a few pictures here. The upper left corner there, you see agronomic cropping. I think that's a picture in Indonesia where forests have been cleared to grow corn. The urbanization in the upper right-hand corner could be seen in many parts of the United States. I don't remember where that picture is from, but up where I lived in the Dallas area, we saw the blackland prairie converted to many neighborhoods that looked a lot like this. And so you see that in many parts of the United States and other parts of the world. Invasive species, that's salt cedar along the Rio Grande River down on the Texas-Mexico border, which has really created problems in terms of changing the biodiversity picture. Pollution in the Appalachian Mountains is shown in the bottom right there. That is the loss of some tree species due to sulfur dioxide pollution coming from coal plants nearby. And so we see that loss. So we see this in many types of ecosystems driven by many different factors. Now, on top of that, we've got another situation that we deal with a lot at the Borlaug Institute and talk about a lot, and that's the world hunger situation. And it's sometimes hard to remember that this is the problem unless you get out of the United States or get away from a place like College Station. But in 2010, nearly 1 billion people were food insecure. There's 3 billion people on the earth that live on less than $2 a day. And the map here shows you the distribution of those areas where the concern is. The brighter colors, the yellows, reds, and oranges, show a higher intensity of food security. So that you see is mostly in Central and South America. It is in Africa, and then it's in Southeast Asia. Those are the places where we have a problem with hunger. And there's been a lot of money pledged to fight this problem. But this is certainly also going to be a factor when we talk about biodiversity, and the loss of biodiversity is how are we going to maintain biodiversity on this earth and feed this many people, as we know there's going to be a lot of growth And so this is another situation in crisis, and it's now become something of interest to governments like the U.S. government that for a while just sort of didn't worry about food production. So I think for those of us that have been in horticulture and agriculture for a while, we've seen sort of this disinterest in our fields. I predict that's going to go back up as this problem intensifies, and we're going to see, for the students here, they're going to see a change in the attitudes about agriculture and horticulture. It's going to be different than it was in my generation, but there's going to be there's going to have to be some attention paid to this. Norman Borlaug said it long ago that the first essential component to social justice is adequate food for all mankind. He's famous for saying that, and he taught that lesson. He taught that this isn't just a problem for poor nations; it's a problem for everybody on the earth. And I have my grandson help demonstrate that process, or that principle here, that economic prosperity alone is not enough. He was hungry, and so I told his mom to give him $1 and see what his reaction would be. And you can see what the reaction would be. He was not at all happy about that, and so he's driving home a message that this you can't eat money. We have to remember that. And now, just to allay any fears, no children were hurt in the making of this photograph. We did give him food right away after that, and he was happy, and he's doing just fine. But anyway, the point is, this is a problem of the earth, and the developed nations are going to have to deal with it. And I think they're beginning to see that point, and that's why we're seeing money being put into feeding the world. And so we're back to this map. Again, the red and oranges and yellows show the areas where this problem is of concern. Now, what I'm going to show next is another map, and Luis Cisneros pointed this out to me, that if you look at the map that we're seeing here, and then you look at another map of the world and look at biodiversity hotspots, you will see they don't match up perfectly, but that often these places that are food insecure are very high in biodiversity. Now, again, it's not a perfect match, but you'll see that the biodiversity hotspots, these are areas that are rich in biodiversity, overlay that map fairly well. You see a lot of biodiversity hotspots in Central and South America, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And so they don't match perfect, but there is certainly a correlation there as you look at where we have food insecurity and where we have biodiversity. That's going to create some additional pressures as we try to feed the world, and it's something we're going to have to address now. But it also provides some opportunities for those places. They certainly, that gives them opportunities to use indigenous crops to improve diets in those countries. It does provide opportunities for economic development, and it provides opportunities for them to recognize the value of biodiversity and its conservation. So there is a problem, but on the flip side, there's certainly some opportunities. Okay, with that now, let's look a little bit into horticulture and biodiversity specifically. We're in a horticulture department here, so let's address that. So how does horticulture impact biodiversity? Well, first of all, in terms of conservation of biodiversity, it can do that indirectly because horticultural crops, we learned this from our very first horticulture class, that horticultural crops use less area than other types of crops and can often be grown at forest margin. So to produce horticultural crops takes less space, therefore less deforestation. Even in some cases, they can be grown up against the forest. And I just show some pictures here of miniaturization in horticulture, that just extreme examples that we learn about early in horticulture, dish gardens, bonsai, terrarium. Horticulture for a long time has been able to grow things in small spaces, relatively small spaces. That's going to be significant as we move forward into the future, and we're going to have to talk more about that we offer an opportunity through horticultural crops to take up less land, and it can be a very useful, valuable alternative cropping system for some of these countries. So that's important. This is a community, and Luis and Bimu and I have visited this area. This is the central Minahasa community in Manado, Indonesia. And it's on the island of North Sulawesi. And this is an area where they're doing a pretty good job, and this shows how they're tucking horticultural crops into the mountainside at the margin of the forest, and they're not just clear-cutting things, but you can see the crops are tucked in there. There's fruit crops also growing in there, and this is really a horticultural wonderland. Now, it helps to be in an area where it's relatively cool and it rains every day, and we wouldn't be able to recreate this in College Station, Texas, for sure. But the point is, they're growing this in a much more, in my view, a much more environmentally responsible way. and seeming to do pretty well from what we could tell when we were there. They're doing pretty well. And so that's just an example. It doesn't always have to be that way. In contrast to this, maybe a little hard to see, but this is a picture. My first glimpse of Indonesia was this, not on the last slide. This was my first glimpse. This is flying into Jakarta, Indonesia, and this is the island of Java, which is the island that Jakarta, the capital, is on. And the first thing I could see was this, which is rice monoculture in Java. And it's ugly. It's an environmental disaster. They've basically just taken all that forest out. It's all in rice paddies. And what was really striking to me is that water that you see just at the bottom of the slide there is the ocean. And the ocean around Indonesia is beautiful, blue water normally. Except near this area, you can see all the erosion that's occurred, and it's just this brown film all along the coast. And it's really a disaster. There's very little native vegetation left. This is what happens when there's pressure on feeding the people. And I guess they had to do this to be self-sufficient in rice, and they still aren't self-sufficient, but at least this is what's happened. But we've got to stay away from it. We can't continue to do that, obviously, throughout the earth to feed people. We've got to come up with better cropping systems than that kind of monoculture for a lot of reasons, but certainly from a biodiversity standpoint, it's important. So what you see in a lot of places in Indonesia is where they're creating rice paddies like this at the expense of the forest that you see in the back. And so that again is putting a lot of pressure on biodiversity. And there's a lot of examples, other examples besides rice. I don't mean to just pick on rice. But the upper left corner there is a photograph of from the air of a palm oil plantation. And that's very controversial. That happens to be a real problem because it's affecting orangutan habitat in Indonesia. And so there's big arguments and fights over this. But you see the way it's done. It's just kind of clear-cutting the forest, and that's what it looks like. Land is scarred. In the upper right corner, you see soybean production in Brazil, where the Amazon region is being deforested to grow soybeans. And then you see a couple of examples below that are African examples from Africa. So it's happening in many places in the world. And this is something that we just can't continue to go on with because we're just limiting the resources that we have. And there's got to be different cropping systems, and we may have to do much more of this. And horticulture, again, offers the chance to produce some high-value crops in much smaller areas like in Manado, near Manado, Indonesia. Now, rice doesn't always have to be produced in that monoculture that I showed earlier. This is also in Indonesia on the island of Bali, beautiful island of Bali. This I would vote as my #1 most beautiful agricultural landscape I've seen on Earth, up to this point anyway. It's the terraced rice production that goes on there. But there again, you see they maintain a lot of other crops in there. There's, I think that's chocolate there and cacao, and then there's various bananas and other things being grown in there. So they're doing some intercropping. They're not destroying the terracing, so there's not a problem with erosion. And they're maintaining some ecosystem here that's viable and I think sustainable. So it doesn't have to be. Rice doesn't have to be grown there. Now, this has been done for many, many years. This area is a very old area. They've produced rice for many years. And, I know the obvious thing is that you can't grow huge quantities of rice that way, but they've been very effective there, and it's impressive landscape to see. Now, another thing that we do in horticulture is that we know that certainly some horticultural crops, particularly the tree fruits and nuts, are trees or shrubs at least that can provide ecosystem services. And so that means they can support wildlife instead of some of these low-growing crops. So birds, for example, bees are very important in terms of pollination. Obviously, we have to have pollinators in some of the fruit crops. And so that's another way growing horticultural crops can help conserve biodiversity in terms of promoting wildlife and supporting some wildlife. Now, of course, there's a fine line between that and pests, and so these are obviously some pests. You can have squirrels or monkeys or deer or Africanized bees that no longer, they go beyond ecosystem services and become real pests. So obviously this is something that has to be carefully controlled. Now, also through landscape horticulture, we know that biodiversity can be conserved in urban areas. Urban greening, making cities more livable, more biodiverse. That's been known for a long time. Central Park in New York City, as you see pictured there, has been known for that for a long period of time. Various kinds of parks and gardens can maintain some level of biodiversity in an otherwise urban area. Tree plantings, rooftop gardens, all those things help promote biodiversity in an area. This is a really interesting example. Luis will recognize this. Luis Bimu and I had a chance to visit this, and I'm talking about the superstructure. That's a building. That's the Marina Bay Sands Hotel and Casino in Singapore. We weren't there to gamble. We were there to observe the biodiversity growing at 600 feet up in the air, because that's a rooftop garden up on top of that. And we had the opportunity to go up there and see that, and it's rather amazing that they've got this garden growing up on top of this building, 650 feet above the city of Singapore, and you see just some of what it looks like. And to say, you never know who you're going to see up there. And here's a couple of people that should look familiar. And they've got full-grown palm trees growing up there and a lot of other things. And they're actually using vertical space to create biodiversity. And you see it's pretty impressive that's growing way, way up on top of a city. And there's swimming pools. This swimming pool is pretty cool. It doesn't have anything to do with biodiversity except the trees that are there, but they have designed this so the image is that if you swim towards that, you'll just swim off and fall into the city. And it's interesting to watch parents as they see their kids swim over there. They know that they're not going to really fall off, but they get nervous anyway, seeing them swim to that edge. But anyway, that's an example of a city, Singapore, which is very green-oriented and eco-oriented, doing some interesting things. Now, they're very rich. They've got a lot of money in that country, and obviously that can't be done everywhere. But that's just an example. Now, again, it doesn't have to be just rich countries, though. Here's Jakarta, Indonesia, rooftop garden. First one is there on top of the parking garage, the Grand Indonesia shopping mall. And so that's some vegetation they have up there. The palms in the foreground at the bottom part of that picture are also on another rooftop garden from which I took the picture. And so even in countries like Indonesia, they're doing some very interesting things with rooftop gardening. And this is 5 stories above the streets of Jakarta, where I go jogging there on the jogging path, and they've got an incredible tropical rooftop garden up there. And then they're using vegetation in some very interesting ways. You see, I don't know what plant that is that's weeping off the balconies there, but they've incorporated into the architectural design of the building. Again, a way to bring some life back into the city. All right, now another way that horticulture helps to conserve biodiversity is through tissue culture propagation of endangered plant species. And so just to give you an example of that, this is some results of a paper that was published in Hort Science by a group from Georgia here this year. And these plants are carnivorous pitcher plants, and they're actually quite ornamental, as you see there. There's 3 species that they worked with that really are very attractive. These are native to bog environments in the U.S., which are being threatened by destruction through urbanization. And then the plants also are subject to poaching because they're nice ornamental plants, and people will dig them up and take them and sell them. And so populations are down about 90% of these carnivorous pitcher plants. So tissue culture then is an opportunity to multiply the plants rapidly and year-round, and then promote species conservation. And they demonstrated that. They had some successful cultures that showed the usual kind of shoot regeneration that Dan Lineberger's seen for years, these kinds of pictures. He's worked with them. But what they found shoot multiplication rates for the one species there, Purpurea, to be as high as 6, meaning they could turn 1 shoot into 6 shoots in a period of 2 months when they used the right cytokinin. In this case, benzoylaminopurine was the right cytokinin to do that. For the other 2 species, Leucophila and Oreophila, the multiplication rates were lower, about 2 to 3, but still significant if you're trying to rapidly multiply an endangered plant. The shoot multiplication rates that they observed were stable for at least 2 years. They could maintain these for 2 years if they subcultured every 2 to 3 months. So when you start to put the laws of geometric progression to this, you get an impressive multiplication. So, for example, with the lowest shoot multiplication rate of 2, which they had with one of the species, they still results in 1 shoot producing over 4,000 shoots in 2 years. And for this particular genus, rooting and survival runs about 80% for those plantlets. And so still means you get over 3,000 plants could be produced from a single shoot in 2 years. So again, if you're dealing with something where you're trying to conserve a species, tissue culture can offer a way to do that. And that's being done very nicely in a lab at University of Florida, Mike Kane's lab. Mike spoke here a few years ago to us in a seminar just like this, and he has the Restoration and Plant Ecology Laboratory there at the University of Florida, and I had a chance to visit that a year or two ago. And he's focusing his efforts on the micropropagation of aquatic wetland and coastal plants, and also some native orchids to restore habitat and to reintroduce some of these plants into these areas that have been affected by particularly urbanization. And so his lab has been very successful at pursuing that sort of thing. All right, let's switch gears a little bit now and talk about the utilization of biodiversity. We've talked about how horticulture can promote or help conserve biodiversity, but horticulture also utilizes biodiversity. And of course, we know that there's opportunities to develop indigenous plants into horticultural crops. I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. There's certainly broadened economic opportunities, but beyond just subsistence farming. These small communities in some of these developing countries can take some of these crops and actually make money on a small amount of space. And again, I'll show some examples of that. Of course, we know that there's a need to improve human diets through fruits, nuts, and vegetables. We know that's a big need in a lot of these countries, and so horticulture offers that opportunity. And I'll start out here with an example from the project that I manage in Indonesia right now, where we're working with several Indonesian universities, and we have several objectives in this particular USAID-funded project. The one I'm highlighting here in yellow is the research objective. And I want to talk just a little bit about that. I won't have time to go into a whole lot of detail about this, but we're looking at bioactive compounds and underutilized plants from Indonesia that have potential human health properties. And those that are looking promising, we're developing good agricultural practices, or GAPs. Sometimes it's called BMPs, best management practices. I think in Indonesia, they're happy just to get good agricultural practices right now. It's a little bit much to look at best management practices, but they're trying to develop good agricultural practices for promising species. And then each of the Indonesian partner institutions have chosen plants. And actually, Joe Masabni was over there at one of the first trip where there was a huge, how many, Joe? 100 plants listed that they could possibly work with, because there's all these incredible plant resources there. And so they had to narrow it. Obviously, you can't, with the limited funds you have in a project like this, you have to narrow it. So Joe was part of that initial discussion when he went over there to try to help them narrow this down. And so ultimately, each of our partner institutions narrowed it to 3 plants that they would work on. And so let me show you those 3. And they're listed here for one of the institutes. That's the Agricultural University at Bogor, which is our lead partner there. They're working with a plant called waterleaf, which is shown in the bottom left corner, that bottom left photograph. That's waterleaf. It's an ingredient for specialty menus that they use it for stir fries and things like that. It has purported overall health benefits, but we need to put a scientific underpinning to those because they're not proven. But one thing we've already learned is that this particular leafy vegetable is very high in dietary fiber, very high, and so it does have that benefit. And that is needed in the Indonesian diet. The second one in the bottom middle there is a plant called turkeyberry. Tacocock is the local name that they have. And these botanical and common names, it gets to be a real nightmare when you start talking about common names. So you really learn why it's important to have binomials. But anyway, that's an edible berry that promotes kidney health, purportedly promotes kidney health, and they're in the process of analyzing that to see if it makes sense. It's supposed to be high in antioxidants, and that's to be confirmed yet. And then the one on the bottom right is a plant called sweetbush that stimulates the production of breast milk in women, which is very important in countries where baby formula just can't be bought off the shelf like it is here. And so those are 3 that they've chosen there, just to give you a sense of what we're working on. On the island of Bali, we work with University of Udayana at Denpasar, and they're working with 3 plants that you would recognize a little bit more maybe. Lemongrass is fairly common, but they're looking specifically for products for Bali, so things that fragrances, cooking properties, those kinds of things. Then there's a bamboo, a very large bamboo that creates a growth hormone that is produced, a human growth hormone, But again, all that is in the process of being analyzed. And then a plant that they call Tapacdara, which I had never heard of Tapacdara, but many of you will know of periwinkle, which is on the bottom right. That's a very common plant, worldwide, used as an ornamental in most places, but they are looking at it for anti-leukemia properties, Hodgkin's treatment, and then some anti-inflammatory properties. So they're in the process of analyzing those plants. Those are not so much unknown plants as some of the others in this project. But they're still underutilized in Indonesia, so they're working on those. And then at Manado, the three that they're working with is Canary nut, which is Canaricum indicum. It's for an edible nut product, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. Then there's a banana, a specific kind of banana called the Gorojo banana that has good overall health properties. It's supposed to be effective in burn treatments and also have anti-inflammatory properties. Again, we need to put the science behind that. And then sugar palm, Moringa pinnata, is an ingredient in a porridge that they make there, and it also seems to have properties to fight dengue fever, which is a problem in the tropics. And so that gives you an idea of where they're looking at these plants that come from the natural biodiversity of Indonesia and trying to develop them into something that might be valuable for the communities there. Just to give you an example, Canary nut, it's a huge tree, so probably even bigger than pecan. It's a huge tree. You can see the trunk there. It produces this green nut that matures to a green fruit that matures to a brown nut. It's quite tasty. Just some preliminary analysis. The chemical composition, highlighted in red there is the protein content. It runs 13 to 14%. Those are 3 different samples from 3 different locations, pretty typically running about 14%, 13 to 14%. Leo, does this look right? Is pecan around 10% protein? Does that make for the... That's about right. So, it's pretty high. 14% is pretty high. It's more than macadamia. It's a little less than hazelnut and less than cashew, which would be pretty high. So it just gives you a comparison. So they're trying to work on this, and it is now commercially available. We've eaten it. It is supposed to be quite healthy. Of course, the first thing we do is dip it into sugar and glaze it and do all that stuff. And I'm not so sure how healthy it is, but it tastes really good. And we've eaten that there. It's pretty high in oleic acid in terms of its fatty acid composition. Again, this is the percent fatty acids in oleic acid shown there, around 44, 45% from 3 different locations. That's important because, could be important because of the positive health benefits that this has in terms of lowering blood pressure. Oleic acid, of course, is common in olive oil. So that's just some preliminary information. It's pretty high in terms of its amino acid composition. Glutamic acid is pretty high, 25 to 30% from 3 different locations. Glutamic acid is a neurotransmitter. It's important for memory and learning. Now, it's a long way to go from saying that and saying if you eat canary nuts, you're going to have a better memory. It hadn't worked for me so far, but there is obviously something to look at least there. But maybe what really is valuable is it lends this savory taste to food, which is referred to, the Japanese coined the term umami, which is the savory taste. And so glutamic acid is known to contribute to that. So again, if we're going to have people eat healthy things, it still has to taste good, and so that may be of importance. We know that biodiversity, we don't have to say a lot about this department, but that if we can get more fruits, nuts, and vegetables into the human diet worldwide, that's going to be very helpful in terms of health. And so using our horticultural biodiversity to do that can be an added benefit to horticultural crops. So something just to think about. A good example, I think, of another area that has almost unlimited potential, especially fruit and vegetable-based food products. And one example just from Texas that I'll start with would be salsa in Texas. And yes, Dr. Byrne, Dr. Lineberger, I think, did you go with us when we went up there to Renfro's a couple of years ago, I guess? And Al Wagner had worked, and he's sometimes called Dr. Salsa. He worked with Doug Renfro of Renfro Foods and helped them with developing the process to create some of these very interesting gourmet kinds of products that are utilizing horticultural biodiversity. And they have these gourmet foods. They take all manner of horticultural crops, the common things like tomatoes and chopped onions that we all know about, and then some very interesting spices and very unusual flavors, and even juices, fruit juices and things. And so they're relying, again, drawing upon the diversity of horticultural commodities to put them into bottles and create these various types of salsas. And there's a whole range. That, at the time, was their product range. They probably have more by now. They're always experimenting for new ones. And you see some of them here. You see a chipotle corn salsa, garlic salsa, raspberry chipotle salsa, mango habanero salsa. We should have brought chips and salsa, I guess, talking about this. But anyway, you can see they're taking on all kinds of variant. And this, I didn't realize this, the value of this, and how, until we went and saw all the different things in the warehouse there, that all the different horticultural commodities they had to have and put together in various combinations to create this range of products. Now, they had some that were quite creative, the Screaming Sphincter habanero salsa, which, and you can see their logo there, their motto, a burning penis within the anus. So Doug's father was not happy about this when he saw that they were bottling this. He thought that was beyond good taste. But anyway, they've gotten very creative, of course, in some cases. Now, the food ingredients. There's a lot of interest in botanical extracts for things that create flavor, this umami characteristic, which is what glutamic acid helps create, various pigments and antioxidants. We had a chance, Luis and Bimu and I, just last month to be at a conference called Food Ingredients Asia, and it was incredible to walk around and see all the different kinds of products that come from horticulture or at least plant-based sources, and how they rely on that biodiversity to be out there. They've got to get these or they can't sell these products. So you see things like this. This is NatureX, a company that has got botanicals, that sells botanicals. These are natural ingredients for food, beverage, nutrition, health, and personal care. And so you just see a range of the colors that they have there. Eurofragrance has various fragrances and flavors that they extract from plants. The spice companies like this one in Indonesia, incredible diversity of things that they rely upon to create their business. And then this is a company from China, from Shanghai, that had an incredible array of dried fruits and vegetables. I'd never seen this many types of dried fruits and vegetables, all for food ingredients. And so again, they're relying on horticultural biodiversity. They're utilizing horticultural biodiversity to create some very novel products, and they're making quite a bit of money doing it. Now, of course, also horticulture impacts biodiversity and utilizes biodiversity through horticultural plant breeding programs. We have experts in this room on that, and we've known that for a long time. Without biodiversity, and there really isn't a chance to do much in the way of breeding. There obviously has to be biodiversity. There's a long history of success stories where indigenous plants have been domesticated into valuable horticultural crops. These programs rely on existing biodiversity, of course, to identify and incorporate new traits into crops through germplasm mining. And there's going to be a real need, though, I think, and a real opportunity for funding for breeders that can deliver on the need for more climate-resilient crops because of the concern about climate change. That prospect has got a lot of people scared, and so resilience to climate change is going to be something from an international perspective that's going to be very important. There's an urgent need to collect seed or other types of propagules from wild relatives of horticultural crops before they disappear. And so that's something that's going to happen soon. And then, of course, plant breeding programs maintain a valuable source of germplasm that in turn helps preserve biodiversity. So we loop back to conservation of biodiversity because we know these programs have seed banks and all kinds of ways to collect genes and store them. Either through seeds or through live plants, like you see these collections here, even right here on Texas A&M. This isn't out on our campus, this is up in Mansfield, but this is the More Rose collection. Again, a collection of biodiverse roses. And so plant breeding programs create a valuable spin-off value, I guess, for maintaining diversity in genes. Now, another complicating factor that I've referred to briefly is this threat of global climate change. And some people say that 70% of the Earth's species risk extinction if global temperatures rise by 3.5 degrees. Now, whether it will rise that much, we don't know, and whether that's an accurate number, but it's serious. Whether it's right on or not, it's something to wake us up. And we know that climate change is controversial, exactly what's happening, but the stakes are high here. And we're going to have to rely on existing biodiversity to develop more climate-resilient crops. for many things, drought, heat tolerance, even flood tolerance in some areas. So that's something that's important. And is it a real situation? Remember, this was summer of last year, not far from here. This is the wildfires that we saw. So while that was going on, I happened to fly back to California, and that was in July of 2011. And that's the mountains just next to the San Joaquin Valley that I showed earlier. And it looked like that. It's not supposed to look like that. It's not supposed to be snow covered in the middle of July. And there they were fighting much cooler and wetter conditions, and the crops were not growing nearly as well as they should at that point in time. And so while we were doing that, this was happening in California. And so really, I think what I'm becoming convinced of is that what we're seeing with global climate change, I don't know about the warming part and the rate of warming and all that, but certainly we're seeing a regular occurrence of 100-year events. Instead of happening every 100 years, we're seeing them happen a lot more often, and that seems to be real. We have the Texas wildfires that I've already mentioned shown there near Bastrop. At the same time, in Australia, they were getting flooded while all that was happening here. So these climate patterns are tricky, and this global climate change has got a lot of people concerned. So just to conclude, horticulture can have a significant impact on conservation and utilization of biodiversity. Again, we can have increased economic yield per unit of land area. We don't need as much space to grow horticultural crops. We can get more human nutrient density out of our crops compared to other types of crops per unit of land area, and that's going to become more critical. Horticulture allows for more diversified cropping systems. We don't do monocultures nearly as much as some of the agronomic crops. We have the possibility of providing more green space and diversity in urban areas. And now, those are just my ideas, and here usually it's time for you to ask me questions, but I'm also throwing out questions for us to think about. And what ideas do you have? Are there other ways that we ought to be talking about how horticulture interacts with biodiversity? I think some measures that we need to take, just food for thought, to really conserve biodiversity in our horticultural ecosystems would be to increase the diversity and rotation of our cultivars that we use, do more mixed cultivations to increase species diversity, have limited field sizes, and then develop and maintain biocorridors that can allow for animal and wildlife movement. And so back to this picture in Manado, I don't know if that's our horticultural Shangri-La, but it's close. And again, we can't repeat that or duplicate that everywhere, but they seem to be doing a pretty good job in at least that small area of creating some of those things that I just mentioned. Now, in our department, should we do more? Should we have more? I don't think we have to change our research, but we might need to slant it more and talk about it more in terms of biodiversity issues. Luis has done a good job, I know, with that and has capitalized a bit on that. Should we do more of that? Should we incorporate more agrobiodiversity into our curriculum? Should we have a course focused on this? Should it be a learning outcome? And just other ideas that any of you might have. I'm just throwing those out for things to consider for possible change within the department. So with that, I'm going to conclude here and acknowledge the support of USAID in our projects. It's helped me get a better grip on all this, and the Borlaug Institute and various colleagues at Indonesian institutions as well as colleagues here. So with that, I'm going to stop and we'll open it up for discussion, questions, comments. Be interested to hear your thoughts.
I have a question for you. What sort of uses you say there at the end, you think to the, we understand like more intercropping systems and things like that make me think of a picture I saw of a slave being pulled by like chihuahuas and Dachshunds and the huskies and the things that they don't go anywhere. I mean, is diversity on the field as important as diversity of maybe different cultivars that can be planted?
Yeah.
What's your opinion?
I think it's got to be some of both. And it's a tricky balance to reach. You've got to have a scale of production that's enough to make money and grow crops. So there's got to be that scale. But I'm not sure that it has to be that grand scale that we've been accustomed to with maximum efficiency and all that, because we're running out of space to do that. Where are we going to do those things? So, but I think back to what you're saying, but yeah, intercultivar differences and things like that are important as well. So I think they both have some importance. The trick is going to be how to balance all this out and reach the right balance. So when you balance with nature, then you've got an economic return that justifies doing this. Otherwise, it's tough. So that's the hard part of this. I don't have the answer. That'll be your generation. You can figure that out. You get that figured out. Whoever can figure that out and get that balance. You know, the Nobel Prize went to Borlaug for basically doing the huge efficient thing. It had to be done, or people would have starved. So I think certainly. But we do hear critics of that now. It's surprising. You got a Nobel Prize winner to save, I forget how many millions of people who credited with saving. But we do hear criticism of the Borlaug Institute. That was not good. That was good. For the reasons talking about the monoculture, the pollution, the loss of soil, the erosion. So that was the Green Revolution. And it looked like that. Just to get to the next step of this earth and feed people, we can't do that again. It's obvious we can't do it again. We're going to have to come up with a more balanced approach that looks something like Manado, maybe. But again, that helps because there's such a nice environment. It's like a garden of Eden here. It's cool, it's moist, and all the right conditions. So you can't do that everywhere. Anyway, Luis, did you have a comment?
Yes, I have a comment and a question. So I'll start with a comment. And going back to your question, you know, I believe that when you start looking at things that you present in relation to biodiversity, horticulture, I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to really make that step further to the part at the beginning. And the reason why I say this is because every country, every part of the world has a unique problem. You mentioned in one of your slides, you said that 1 billion people basically are under conditions where they're hungry, basically. But if you look at statistics, there's 1 million people that are overweight and obese in the world.
Yeah.
And that means that many of the countries associated to developed countries have this big problem that there's such a supply of food that they don't know how to eat. You know, you go to these other countries like Indonesia that have these big products where they have rice, but they don't know how to supply these antioxidants, vitamins, through horticultural products to complement that type of food.
We get tired of rice when
Yes. You go to Peru, and then you see that the product they have there, they don't have jobs. But they're resolving an issue by planting horticultural products in the desert, and they're exporting. So what's interesting is that horticulture seems to be able to satisfy all these different problems by attacking the problems in different ways. If it's a problem in countries where they need jobs, it's a huge opportunity to supply that type of opportunities to do that. If it's in Indonesia, it's through producing crops that provides complementary to the things that they have in the case of rice. In the United States, it's a way to basically show people that there's alternatives to the way we're eating right now. So I see it from that perspective. And I'm wondering, and here comes the question, I'm wondering if universities like the United States, many parts of horticulture, and I'm wondering if there is really universities that are facing or addressing these issues, this issue in horticulture from an international point of view. Because if there isn't, this is our opportunity. And if there isn't, I believe that an area like this gives opportunity for all of us to participate. Because this is interdisciplinary nature. You will see that there's going to be people, there's going to be areas where to make this whole thing work, you need to have full companies that will actually be buying these things. You need to have people in farming participating. You need to have people in breeding, production, in the area of health, the dishes that some of us work on that. You'll have to have people, in commercialization. And I mean, there's so many opportunities that I believe that this is the opportunity for our department, if there isn't, to be the leader. Not sure.
Yeah, there are other universities that think about it. Not so much, maybe not too much in horticulture, maybe not too much in the United States. There's certainly some in other countries that are thinking along these lines. Certainly people in Italy are talking about this. Now they tend, in my view, to couch it a little bit too much towards just organic agriculture and all principles. And there's some good principles of organic production that this follows. But I'm not one to just say that that's the only way we can do it. There's going to have to be some other inputs. And I don't see how we can feed the world with just straight organic production. But there are countries like Italy that read papers about this, and that's what they're promoting, is that we go to this all organic. I don't know that it's efficient enough to be able to really meet the needs of what we're facing. We're facing a huge growth of population. I don't see it. I think that's too extreme, but there are others thinking about it. At least I don't think we're the only ones. But most, I don't know that many work departments yet in this country are thinking a lot along these lines. I mean, I showed you an example, Mike King in Florida, tissue culture conservation for more ecosystem restoration, that kind of thing. In terms of food, I don't know. Maybe others know about other possibilities in other places. But I think we're going to have to talk more about how in horticulture we impact economic development, we address climate change, human health through diversification, all those things that we've talked about, as well as the conservation of biodiversity. Now, we can do this in less space because of the way horticulture works. So, I don't know the exact names. Yes, Betsy.
Well, I thought it was interesting that you were talking about agriculture's role, potentially, or horticulture's role in preserving diversity. Some of the examples were, the gardens and the tissue culture that you mentioned, but still, you're still imposing a set in terms of biological diversity, but you're still selecting particular species or even particular genotypes. And so, and then as we promote markets for crops that are out there, then we develop a demand for people to go out and maybe over-harvest these particular crops. And so, there's sort of a balance there. It's almost like we need to keep the footprint of agriculture as small as possible, and try to rectify that with, increasing demand.
Yeah. That's another angle to approach it from. Yeah.
We had a speaker about 10 or 12 years ago at a science conference that we had every year named Dennis Avery from the Hudson Institute, and he'd done a lot of work on the fact that agriculture, or modern agriculture, was not the problem, that it was the solution. And the example that he used was the case of deforestation, which was being done in Indonesia. They were destroying the forests to be able to do, like you illustrated, where they planted that corn, and they probably got 1/100th of the yield that they would get on an equivalent space in Illinois or Iowa or someplace like that. So his concept was that it was a political problem with the people in Indonesia who were destroying the rainforest to grow a crop that was not intended to be grown there, to produce milk that was not intended to be grown there, so that they could compete on the world market, where somebody else could obviously produce much more efficiently than they could. So his idea was that somehow we ought to come to an agreement that those places that are destroying the biodiversity should be rewarded in some way for maintaining it, and those places that were capable of producing huge quantities of food products at a reasonable penalty to the environment should be able to be encouraged to do that, to make their money that way. But it all, Charlie Hall needs to be here to tell us about the economics of it, but it's all about economics. It's about
and the political boundaries that create the challenges is certainly a problem. And, so that's right.
I agree with the point on agreement. Working with vegetable growers here, even locally here, with the farmers market, they compete with each other. They all want to grow the same crops and they compete with each other. I asked them one time, why don't you come to an agreement and you specialize in this family of crops, or this crop, pepper, tomato, beans, green crops, this way you can share with each other and not compete with each other and understand. And then drop the price because everybody's flooding the market with tomatoes at the same time. So I think that's not going to work. But I think biodiversity can also be at a little bit larger scale. In a country where a town or a regions or a farm grows one crop, the farm next to it grows one crop. It doesn't have to be 100 crops in 1 acre to be called biodiversity. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. So if you can look at these, it's all about scale. What you're talking about is biodiversity. You can look at, an individual population all the way out to the whole ecosystem. So, that's the factor to find.
The challenge that hit me when I was looking at all those diverse crops that you're growing is for those to be brought onto a worldwide market, you've got to have year-round supply and uniformity of the appearance of the materials, which are all sort of work against biodiversity.
Yeah, that is a huge problem with a lot of these things. Now, the ones we're working with there in Indonesia are primarily going to be, they're not really exports. Some maybe, but most of them are just, all we're trying to do is get them to a point where they can produce them and sell them beyond their local village. Right now, we're not worried too much about export. But yeah, if you get on to export, then it's a whole different ballgame. This is just what you said. It's got to be, it's very competitive. There's all kinds of same issues to deal with there. But at least right there in those communities we're talking about, we're just trying to get them to be able to go beyond the boundaries of their community and help them grow these more efficiently. So that first of all, they have enough production, they can sell it beyond. And then we also, there's another aspect that I didn't talk about here, food safety and quality aspects, so that they're legally certified to do that. Because they can't go beyond the boundary of their village selling a product if they don't have certification. So that's the part I didn't mention. That's going on. It makes me a little nervous when I visit these communities. They want you to taste their products, and they're not legally certified. And our systems are not accustomed to some of the things that are in some of that stuff. So we have to be very careful about that. And they're trying to be very nice and share things with us. And there's some of the beverages and things that they want you to taste. Fortunately, our hosts usually step in and say, okay, wait a minute, I'll take that. They distract them so that we don't end up really sick. So there's all that kind of stuff. Quality, safety.
Manado Borlaug stands in the advising of the state of Texas or in general United States in the protection of biodiversity and sustainable agriculture. Do you have any, let's say, advice for the main legislation or the?
Well, the Borlaug Institute mainly works internationally, so they don't really do a lot here. Of course, we don't have expertise of our local people, but the Borlaug Institute's mission is agricultural development, international agricultural development. They usually work in development or very poor countries. So that's the mission. So no, not a lot really that we deal with here in the United States. And really developed countries now, we partner with developed countries, to work in these countries. But really, that's kind of beyond the mission of the Borlaug Institute. It's mainly set up to work internationally on international agricultural development projects in developing countries. So we don't really have a lot there. I'm sure there are experts here. I know we have a group, by the way. There is a group, Applied Biodiversity Sciences group here at Texas A&M, mainly housed in wildlife and fisheries. And their faculty, they've got an interdisciplinary faculty. I don't think we have anybody in our department. I don't think anybody's part of that group. They might have some ideas about that, more so than people.
I'm obligated to tell those that will have to leave. It's after 5. You're welcome to leave. This is a great discussion. So, I'm sure Dr. Davis will be happy to stay, and for those who have any other comments, but please feel free to have to go. I have one last comment. I think is not to be cynical here. As long as the global economy is money-driven, pursuit of money, pursuit of wealth, pursuit of where biodiversity is never going to be a real success. Because
Well-
whether at the small scale, like the farmers market guy, or at the national scale, we still have to pay debt, we still have to buy things, you know?
Yeah, it does all ultimately come down to that. You know, some of those things that I showed you, like palm oil, is driven, palm oil deforestation to produce palm oil is driven by corporate greed. That's really that's what it is, and it's short-term profits, you know, for maybe long-term damage to the environment. So, you know, there are corporations though that are beginning to understand that if they're going to have long-term health, they can't continue to behave in that way. But yeah, that's a factor for sure. We got to be realistic that economics always comes into play for sure. Yeah, it always comes down to that, doesn't it?
Thank you. It was a very interesting topic.